Hafade and greetings, everybody. Thank you for visiting this virtual seminar to celebrate Professor Kyeyoung Park's new book, LA Rising, Korean Relations with Blacks and Latinos After Civil Unrest. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Toba-Ongar, otherwise known as the Los Angeles Basin and the Southern Channel Islands. We at UCLA humbly pay respects to their ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. I also want to thank Karen Umamoto, the Helen and Morgan Chu Chair of the Asian American Studies Center, and a professor in the Department of Urban Planning, Asian American Studies for supporting our session. I also want to acknowledge the students of AAS 200A for participating in this forum. Today is November 24, 2020. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Kyeyoung Park of Anthropology and Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is the author of the book, LA Rising, Korean Relations with Blacks and Latinos After Civil Unrest, 2019, published by Lexington Books. Her first book, The Korean American Dream, Immigrants and Small Business in New York City, 1997, by Cornell University Press, is the winner of the Association for Asian American Studies Book Award. She is also the co-author of Korean Americans' Ethnic Relationship in Multi-Ethnic Los Angeles and the co-editor of Korean American Economy and Community in the 21st Century. Professor Park's current research projects are the Korean immigrant communities in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and the second generation Korean American transnationalism. Once again, congratulations, Kyeyoung, on producing this important study of class, ethnic, and race relations in Los Angeles. To start our conversation, can you please tell us how you first came to identify this project? First, how did you come to identify this project? And relatedly, can you provide a short summary of your book? So how did you come to this project? And can you provide for the audience a short summary of your book?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Camacho for inviting me to your class. As a graduate student, I was really concerned, and I wanted to know how and why my fellow Korean immigrant merchants were resented. That is why once I came to Los Angeles and I embarked on that research project on Black Korean tension. And Black Korean tension was supposed to be most controversial ethnic tension in modern history. But during the 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest, actually there are more Latinos who were arrested for participating, in rioting or other matters. So I had to expand to include Latinos, mostly Latin American immigrants from Mexico and Central American countries such as El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. And then I realized that I am studying ethnic experience, not the usual way. Conventionally, scholars studied mostly ethnic specific experience, but gradually, the way I approach, the way I study ethnic experience was in a way, we can say like post-structuralist way in relation to other race and ethnicity or in opposition to. So then I realized that idea of how Korean Americans and Korean American experience has been mirrored and reflected, and I realized that that is more important than what Korean Americans are saying about talking about their own experience, how they are seeing, because identity matter is often, it is how externally imposed. that has become more important than the matter of self-identification. I'm saying here, ascription and those matters. I think my interest in really studying African American and Latino experience led me even to my new research project in South America. Because of my interest in Latin American immigrants, then I had to go back to where they came from. Not exactly, but South American countries such as Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay. So anyway, so I think that, and then also I realized that how Black Korean relations and Latino Korean relations constituted and contributed to a new race, racial system in the southwestern part of the US. I am really tired of just hearing about white, Black binary, racial mother. I think it's just, I mean, if we want to stop talking about Asian American experience and Latino experience just being as kind of white, kind of Black, kind of reductively, then it's not enough just to add, okay, here is, colorfully, here is Asian American and Latino in addition to white and Black. I think we have to think about mother, without eclipsing anti-Black racism, what happened to white over Black racism, altogether. All right, so in terms of really summary, I conceptualized Black Korean tension and Latino Korean relations as really racialized, classed, and cultural conflict, so then my hypothesis was that different racial minorities, they are impacted in a different way. I mean, for instance, Asian Americans have been racialized in a different way. So I realized that structural inequality, various dimensions of structural inequality impacted on racial minorities experience and further impacted on their relationship. Because different racial minorities, really they had a differential access to, for instance, U.S. racial hegemony, capitalism, and national identity. We all know that Asian Americans have been really perceived as whatever perpetual foreigner. That means really outsider, So the question of really national belonging and symbolic integration. So it's like it requires several steps. So I think I really look at here that analytically, when I say structural inequality, that means dimension of race and racism, and class conflict, and also culture and cultural clash, and politics of citizenship. So really, when we look at even Black Korean tension, it wasn't simply like, you guys make more money. That's just too simplistic, So I see these dimensions, how it really impacted various racial minorities, and furthermore, how it impacted on their relationship. So I think that's what I call racial cartography, graphically really visualizing the field of racial positions, So it's really not a matter of only a racial hierarchy. And we need more than one dimension, white over Black hierarchy, I think there is also, I mean, when we talk about racial status and entitlement, it's not a simple question how it, that kind of status will be given, or privilege, white privilege would be given. And then also there is a question of racial distancing. So that means how, these racial minorities, how they feel close to each other, why even African Americans, they feel they close towards maybe Native Americans and Latinos and white Americans, and they think Asian Americans are far away from them, racial distancing is the concept that I developed from the concept like social distance, that ideas. So I mapped out and also really in South Central, what African Americans are saying here is that, and I don't think they are the first group of people who are saying it, but in the US, we had a kind of narratives of national belonging. The idea is that different groups, particularly immigrant groups, at some point, they would be redeemed, like Jewish Americans or African Americans, they would be redeemed, but it's not automatic. You have to earn it. You have to demonstrate. So what African Americans are saying here is that they really, shed blood, sweat, and tears. They struggled, they built this nation, and that wasn't enough. Nobody gave them any, right or whatsoever. They had to fight. So not only they built this nation and they struggled, really they suffered, but they had to fight. So what they are saying here is to Korean Americans that you guys are kind of newcomers and it's not enough to make money, whatever socioeconomic indicator is higher than African Americans or Latinos, but you guys will have to earn it. You have to contribute to build this society and also, fight. Then, because nobody gave them anything free, nothing was free. So African Americans, they had to earn. So they are saying, Korean Americans, that you guys will have to earn it, So I think that is the idea, I would say, the overall about racial cartography. So this model of racial cartography is kind of flexible. So that means that in the future, if African Americans, they make progress in terms of socioeconomic indicators, then they are going to go up. And then when Korean Americans, right now, they are to the left, but when Korean Americans will make a contribution, to participate politically, culturally, and socially, then they would be moved to the right, because to the right is mostly, like it's a question about territoriality. African Americans are saying that we've been here, longer than you guys, okay? So Korean Americans' position, racial position, will be moved to the right. So I think it's kind of flexible, I would say that, yeah. And of course, I put Native Americans and African Americans to the right, because African Americans were supposed to be here at 1616, but in LA, LA was founded by 44 people from New Spain, actually later it became Mexico, right? Including mixed race African Americans. So in LA, actually Latinos' position is to the right, But in South Central, Latinos are doing worse than African Americans. Therefore, their position, their socioeconomic status is lower. So it varies. There is a national racial formation and there is a regional racial formation, but regional racial formation is influenced by national one, but it's not the same, yeah. And yeah, so I think maybe I think I already used up some time here.
No, that's fine, Kyeyoung. Actually, what I want to expand a little bit more on racial distancing, as you note, and I know you also want to show. Do you want to show your model first before I get into a quote that you have around racial cartography. Do you want to show a model because you're referring to your model? You want to show that
Okay.
first?
All right. Okay. Let me do that.
And then I can get into the next question.
Right. Yeah. Um, okay. So here is my analytical model and showing Black Korean tension here. So analytical categories like race and racism and citizenship, culture and class, it operates unfortunately all negatively. So, various dimensions of race and racism. For instance, I'll give you a quick example. In relation to Black Korean tension, actually in South Central, until there was a verdict by Judge Collin, because Judge Collin, didn't give any sentence term to Korean grocer who killed actually African-American teenager over shoplifting in a dispute. She received, apparently, according to my interviewees, she received racialized sentence. It was not a white sentence nor a black sentence. It was kind of Asian American sentence. So when I say race and racism, I relate to this kind of white racism at criminal justice system and also media and financial institutions and educational settings. But also I include unfortunately, Korean immigrant merchants, their anti-Black racism, and also African Americans, their anti-Asian racism, anti-Korean, anti-Asian racism. So these Korean immigrants and also African Americans, their prejudices, it's more prejudices, it's different from white racism, and I call it as subaltern racism. So these are not backed up by institutional power or white privilege. So for instance, Korean immigrants, they are almost biological racism, kind of scientific racism, I think, which has been discredited. And then also African Americans, they are Orientalist and nativist racism. It was equally, I would say that, dangerous because it led to killing or other matters. Okay, so I think that's how I explain various dimensions of really these structural inequality and how it really works negatively and leading to 4 degrees of separation and then ultimately ethnic tension. All right, but Korean Latino relations is these analytical categories, structural inequality plays different roles. So for instance, race and citizenship didn't play negative role, unlike for Black orientation, but culture and class plays negative role. For instance, much of Latino Korean relation has been labor relations because most workers at Korean immigrant owned business establishment, they were Latino workers, so I think a class and culture. So in this case, I see a 2 degree of separation and two degree of convergence. So it doesn't lead to any tension, but right now, respect for caution. Okay, so I will just, briefly, I explained it very briefly. Okay, all right.
Thank you, Kyeyoung. I just want just to piggyback on what you've shared, and this is for our audience. I just want to elaborate what you mean by the concept of racial cartography.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, quote, racial cartography is a mental roadmap where people chart out their historical relationship to each other. And this framework foregrounds the dialectical relationship between whiteness, blackness, Latino-ness, and Asian Americanness. Racial cartography is full of unequal and differential power relations, not just between whites and African Americans, but also between other racial categories pertaining to race, class, and citizenship in different institutional contexts, end quote. And in your opening comments around what led you to this project, and you fleshing a little bit out more Korean Latino relations, what you call racial distancing, subaltern racism, moving beyond the black-white racial binary. I mean, these are clearly things that appear in your work. But given what you shared with racial cartography as this mental roadmap full of differential power relations and premise on a historical relationship in and between communities. For our audience, can you elaborate upon the ways in which African Americans, Koreans, and Latinos converge upon a shared historical relationship that help them to better appreciate and understand each other? So we're already getting into the thick of your ethnography around conflict, around racism, around precarity. But let's pause for a second and talk about the ways in which racial cartography allow these communities through a shared historical relationship to better understand each other.
All right, Kiss. I think I can point out this kind of moment, historical moment, I would say that. But I don't mean they were always able to appreciate and understand each other or, recognize the moment, okay? So that's why it requires role, really by scholars and also activists. Okay, first of all, I have to mention here that South LA has been very much segregated from the rest of LA. South LA has been an industrial core of LA. All the factories we have had, but it has been really segregated. And really bottom line is that since the early on of the history of LA, probably even 19th century, early 20th century, minorities, really they are segregated, separated from the rest of what we call WASP people, including Jewish people and African Americans and Mexican Americans and Asian Americans from the downtown establishment. And there has been a, really racially separated the kind of residential covenant. By law, minorities couldn't live in a certain area. That explains in a way that why Japanese American communities stopped around Crenshaw Boulevard and why African American communities stopped at Crenshaw Boulevard, because they couldn't go beyond the Western area, like UCLA area, you see, because the residential segregation, so minorities couldn't move in certain areas. So it became this kind of South Central. So I would say that unfortunately, even in this new millennium, I think there has been a report saying that people, West LA, including myself, their per capita income, median household income is like 10 times, 12 times more than those people in South Central. And also people on West LA, they live 12 years longer than people in South LA, even these days, okay? But anyway, historically, because of this residential segregation, which was really, banned in only late 60s, 1960s. Until then, residential segregation led to other kind of segregations. For instance, school segregation. So Japanese American children, they were sent to segregated inferior schools, and just like also Mexican American children. Although Mexicans in the 19th century, initially they were viewed as white, as a US citizen, but anyway, so residential segregation still leads to school segregation. And then also at workplace, I think often workplace was also segregated and segmented. And particularly African Americans, they worked just among themselves, while Mexican Americans, sometimes they worked together with white. In those days, it was a white privilege to be able to work as an industrial worker. So minorities, they had to work as agricultural workers or, you know, domestic workers, right? So, so I think these all, you know, and that's why when we had the juice riot, I think Kiss knows better than me. It was attack against Mexican American, Filipino American, and also some African American GIs, I would say that. So it led to the kind of attack in before 1965. Actually, most race riot involves white Americans attacking, you know, minorities, often African Americans. Okay, but since 1965, it has changed. So okay, back to the question. I will say that these residential segregation, you know, that's why even Mayor Bradley, even in you know, 1960s or so, he couldn't really buy a home, you know. He had to ask white people, pretend that, you know, they are gonna buy a home. So you see, so anyway, these residential segregation and school segregation also led to, in a way, it's like related to anti-miscegenation law, legally banning any marriage for white people marrying white, you know. So I think in a way, this explains that. I'm sorry, I'm like talking about this more non-necessary when they are really, you know, forming coalitions. Like, for instance, in the early 20th century, Mexican American, Japanese American agricultural workers, they form coalitions. You know, and when only Mexican Americans are allowed to be a member of the union, then they rejected those until they also allow Japanese American workers, agricultural workers, to be a member of the union. They are not gonna be, you know. So anyway, so I'm saying here is that minorities have been really in various ways that they have been separated and segregated, you know. But there are moments that different racial minorities, they got together, they formed coalitions, and they fought together, I would say that.
Thank you, Kyeyoung. I'm actually glad you brought up segregation, anti-miscegenation laws, redlining, these kinds of things, because it is and coalition building. And so, do you think if we could just spend a couple more minutes on this subject, because I'm thinking of like Rudy Guevara wrote this book, Becoming Mexipino, multi-ethnic identities and communities in San Diego.
Mm-hmm.
And in that book, as an example, Mexicans and Filipinos, by virtue of residential segregation, work segregation, were by default is sharing these same spaces, urban spaces, and by their proximity to each other, but also through their affinity through Catholicism, you know, structural affinity, that they were able to create solidarities, to create unions, you know, to coalition based on a shared present, right? And then, so that's one example. You have also Scott Kurashige, as you know, and you cite in your book, who writes about Black Japanese relations in Los Angeles, his book, The Shifting Grounds of Race. And Scott, as many other sociologists and historians, and like yourself, and have shown that even though there were these conflicts historically, that even Blacks and Japanese, African Americans, grocers, you know, the civic clubs form different kinds of friendship, allyship, etc. Did you see that in your work? Did you see that in these kinds of earlier histories of antagonism, but also of affinity, play out in getting? I know unrest and uprising is central to your book, but and maybe you could talk about, to give a concrete example, like the coalitions that happen after the unrest. You know, how do you think these shared paths help with the coalitions, if you want to focus on one coalition or one organization?
Yeah, definitely in the more contemporary context, for instance, in Koreatown, I would say that clearly there has been a series of coalition building between Korean Americans and Latino, community organizations, so leaders and activists over, labor issues and also immigrant rights activism. So, I mean, mostly on behalf of Latino and Korean immigrant workers. So, for instance, Kiwa Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance. I mean, I just received an email. They are saying that they are going to feature Korean Salvadorian dance team. So yeah, I mean, this year, I think next week. So I think it was about really Latino and Korean American hotel workers and first of all, garment factory workers and also hotel workers and supermarket workers, and yeah. So I think there has been a series of campaign, and which was very successful, I would say that. And then also later, also labor joined because traditionally and historically, labor was kind of hostile towards really immigrants, but when the leadership became Latinos, then it has completely changed. Okay, so so I think there has been a series of coalition building and campaigns successfully in Koreatown between Korean Americans and Latinos, and then also gradually in South LA. There has been also coalition building between Latino and African Americans because, like for instance, to organize African American security officers, because I think Latinos and labor groups, they realized that they will have to use African Americans, the civil rights movement, that kind of strategy, and then also many security officers are African Americans from South Central. So, so I think I didn't see many, explicit coalition buildings between Korean American and African Americans, but I think at least among Korean Americans and Latinos, and now Latinos and African Americans, and in these cases all mediated by labor. But I think Korean Americans, African Americans, they are also, meeting together. Like for instance, Christians, I mean, since the riot and even before the unrest, they've been meeting together and then sometimes together regularly. Korean American, Latino, and African American Christians, they gather together, and also some Korean American community organization is called like FACE. They are modeled after African American, churches. Okay, so and then also after the unrest, some Korean American churches they had the leadership by African Americans. So so I think these were, and I think that explains now LA politics. LA became one of the most progressive city, but LA wasn't like that. In the past, LA was one of the reactionary and very conservative city. But now politically, since probably year 2000 that we elected Mayor Villaraigosa, I think LA politics turned very progressive and in some cases radical. So this is really different from other cities in the nation, I would say that. Okay, yes.
Kyeyoung, thank you so much for bringing up that point, because I think when folks read your book, they're gonna appreciate, like me, how even though they are these historical relationships, there's these interracial conflicts, subaltern racism, racial distancing, as you put it, that in the more recent period, more contemporary, LA has increasingly become democratizing, more progressive, even left cityscape in a lot of ways. And we can attribute that to, the folks in your study that are working really hard, whether through faith-based organizing, through union organizing. Those things are apparent. And we did also thank you as well for flagging some of these tensions and relations between Koreans, African Americans, and Latinos. We have a few more minutes, and we'll see if we have some chance for the students to join us. But I do want to end at least or segue our conversation on the matter of method. If we can spend a couple minutes on method. And it's regarding what you call intercessory ethnography. As you note, this ethnographic approach draws on feminist and post-colonial interventions and methodologies as much as it privileges dialogue, subjectivity, and critical consciousness on the part of the observer and the observed. Given that you employed a team of ethnographers in your monograph, in your study, can you explain how this collective and critically self-reflexive form of ethnography allowed you to better engage African American, Korean, and Latino communities? So what is it about the collective critical self-reflexivity of a team, right? A group that helped you? Conversely, can you also discuss any anticipated or unexpected limitations that surface as a result of that method?
Okay, thank you, Keith. This concept, intercessory ethnography, I came up with as a tool. The idea is that since, I am not like any typical ethnographer from the global north and then who went to global south. I am kind of from the community, although I wasn't from South LA. So I couldn't just collect data. I'm not a tax collector and just, gather the data and then pack and then take off. I couldn't do that. So what I'm saying here is that it's gotta be a kind of critical exchange. I couldn't just record what my interviewees were saying, like passively writing down, record, okay, is this what you were saying, and then leave. I couldn't do that. So I had to use the chance also as an educator and, kind of organizer. It's like Paulo Freire, educational philosopher. He talked about raising, consciousness. So I had to really challenge, in some cases, my informants, particularly young Korean Americans. So in a way that they could really unlearn, what they internalized. Okay, so that was the idea. So basically, I challenged it when they had like very problematic, prejudiced sentiment, So I think I was able to do that, but it was limited because I couldn't challenge necessarily all the Korean immigrant merchants, And then also when, for instance, African Americans are saying, they said that they witnessed that sometimes even Latinos, they get kind of freebies, they get some money, they got 50,000, whatever. I don't think that was true, but I couldn't quite challenge, what they are saying. So I think it's really, when I say challenging, it's not just from the people to the researcher, but it could be really all from researcher to people we are studying. What I'm saying is, otherwise, it's very condescending and paternalistic. You just record and then you report. This is what they say, this is what they say. But I think really research is different from really, collecting texts, imposing texts. So, but it's gotta be done very carefully. You gotta gain trust. In my case, they already knew who I was. They were repeating what I said, and they were eager to hear what I was thinking about. And I used like a Korean form of oral performance. And in that case, it's like a call and response, that kind of format. So they anticipate, they would like to hear what is your thought on what I'm saying, Usually they lament And you are supposed to say, oh, that isn't that bad, I mean, something like that. So I think that's how I came up with, but I know that in no way we are imposing our views, but it's more how to educate ourselves mutually, So I was pointing out the importance of this kind of having critical exchange among the people that we study. And because I had a team of multiracial research assistant, and my research assistant had a varied relationship. Sometimes they were challenged by the people in South Central, thinking that you probably don't understand what we are going through in South Central. Although in this case, the research assistant was African American, but she was middle class, and she made it very clear. She might not know, feel free to point out, so I think it was kind of a varied, I would say that, yeah. And then also Latino interviewees, as if they were the anthropologists, they will tell you, all the cultures are equally valid. There is no way to say some culture is better than other cultures, you see, as if they were the anthropologists. So I think I'm talking about this, critical exchange and sometimes cross debate, cross argument. So that seems to be better than passively, just writing down what your interviewees are saying and then report. See, these people are like, making this kind of outrageous statement. But anyway, I was interested in these people's, their analysis and interpretation, not like, just their attitude, whether they like or they don't like, but I was interested in hearing their interpretation and analysis, and as a philosopher. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Kyeyoung. And for our readers out there, this is the cover of the book. Right? Please purchase a copy. Support Professor Kyeyoung Park. We do have, we could. We're almost at time, but I do want to, if anybody in the class wants to ask a question or two, we could spend a few minutes on that. Anybody want to share anything?
Mm-hmm.
I think Kyeyoung there.
No more questions.
No more questions. But I have to say though, that I read your book, and in our discussion of the class, it's so ethnographically rich, that you could easily bring in discussions around Korean transnational labor, around the U.S. wars in Korea, ongoing war rather. We could talk a lot about Central American migration flows, the superstructure of white racism, right, and of I mean, it's such a multi-layered, ethnography. And I actually saw some of your participants talking back, in your interviews. I mean, that there were people in your study, African American, Korean, and Latino, that were talking back in a dialogue way, right? And what was that like for you as an ethnographer? Going through your work and building these relationships, interviewing people, and then you got into these dialogue. What were the takeaways for you when your participants started not just simply to inform you as the ethnographer, but to dialogue, and they, in that way, they became ethnographers? Like, what were the takeaways for you?
Well, I think I really, before I went out to South Central and talked to people, I didn't know Black Korean tension has much to do with race and racism. I didn't know that because before me, hardly, almost no scholars went out to South Central. Almost, I mean, there have been many books about Black Korean tension, but it's strange that none of the scholars, they really conducted any field work in South Central. So I think I realized that middleman minority, whatever hypothesis is like, it's not sufficient, and there is a lot more stories are going on. And because they told me that before the Dratch Collins verdict, they didn't feel any tension, you know? Yeah. But anyway, I would say that back to Keith's question. Actually, one of my key informant, the merchant, was murdered. I mean, I wrote it in chapter 5, you know? So we conducted like observation for almost for an year, you know, and he didn't have any language barrier or, you know, I mean, yeah. So it's not like Black Korean tension can be explained as a matter of language differences or cultural differences. I mean, you know, so he was able to communicate well, but he was murdered. So I think it's forever. It will be my burden and my responsibility, you know, because people in South Central, even at the beginning in the early 90s, they were skeptical of the scholars. They were saying that researchers always came to South Central. They tried to cooperate with them. Nothing has changed. So they were very skeptical. So really, even in writing a book, you know, my question is, you know, how I do justice to really towards their struggles in South Central, you know. So so I think that's kind of in a way my burden, and that's why people in South Central, they were skeptical. They were much more critical of journalists because they knew that journalists, they write whatever they like, you know, and out of context. But even about the scholars, they don't understand. They know that researchers came in, they conducted research, but then why that didn't bring into, you know, they didn't bring any change in their community. Still they are struggling, you know. So I think that is the kind of burden that we have as a researcher and as an ethnographer. So that is the bottom line when I write a book, when I write any articles, that in what way I can do justice to people in South Central. I don't know. I don't think this is a way directly answering his question, but it is really hard, you know, as a scholar. We talk about applied whatever, engaging, you know, critical ethnography or participatory ethnography, all those matters. But you know, in relation to the people that we study, is really profoundly very challenging question. You know, so we have to do our best to convey what they reported to us, because as a witness, you know, so we don't repeat, you know, but we repeated already what happened in the 1965. We repeated in 1992, and who knows what will happen in the future, you know. So yeah, so I think that's how I think about this.
But that's a great way. Thank you, Kyeyoung. That's a great way to close our seminar in celebration of your book, because the burden of ethnography in the 1800s was to collect, right? It was to collect the curio, the curiosity, to salvage the disappearing native, right? To talk about biological essentialisms, to talk about eugenic hierarchies. That was the burden of particularly Western, you know, canonical anthropology, right? From the Malinowskis to the Mead to, you know, Boas, all of them. I'm really heartened to hear that anthropology, as you understand it, that its burden today is justice, right? And that however we make of that, and toward the best of our ability, and also with our own faults and limitations. I want to thank you. This has been a great study, and I know the seminar had a great discussion. They're very quiet now because they also know they're now part of virtual history. I'm just gonna make sure I get all of them. You know, we have Jen, Maya, Lahanra, Lexi, Joy, Joseph, Brooke, Dimitri, Kelly. Oh, Dimitri's friend, the cat there, Farine. So yes, I want to close on that note. I want to thank again Kyeyoung and Karen of the Asian American Studies Center. Any other thing you want to add before we go, Kyeyoung?
No, thank you very much for the chance to really share again my book with you guys. You guys look maybe at this point tired, already had a chance to discuss my book, right? So anyway, you can feel free to email me, you know where I am. So, but anyway, I thank you again. And thank you very much, Kiss, for this chance to talk
Oh, yeah,
to
you're
you.
very
Speak
welcome.
to
Well,
you.
everyone,
Yeah.
please let's congratulate Professor Park. And I'll see you folks next Tuesday. Thank you, Kyeyoung.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.